Barış İçin Kadın Sesi podcast serisi, SES Eşitlik ve Dayanışma Derneği'nin Operation 1325 ve Swedish Institute işbirliğiyle hayata geçirdiği Barış İçin Kadın Sesi projesi kapsamında hazırlanmıştır.
Welcome to an English episode of Global SES. I'm very pleased to share with you our podcast with Dr. Leila Alieva'yı, which we recorded around a month and a half ago. An academic and a think tank founder, Leila is currently an affiliate at the REES Oxford School for Global and Area Studies at the University of Oxford. Her academic interests are in energy, security, and conflict processes, political regime dynamics of oil-rich states, with a special focus on the Caucasus region. Her articles have been published in academic journals like Journal of Democracy, The International Spectator, Southeast European and Black Sea Studies. I gave her the lead to introduce herself in the podcast, and I'm very happy to have had this conversation with her. I know Leila, I think for maybe 6 years now, and we met in Oxford, and we're recording this podcast in Oxford today. So I'll just leave the word for her to introduce herself.
Okay, I was born in Moscow, but I grew up in Baku, Azerbaijan. Then I went back to Moscow. I lived there 10 years, but after that, I returned to Baku when I started my civil society activities, independent think tank business. And then I've been going abroad for fellowships and, teaching or research fellowships. I went to Harvard and studied because my project on ethnic conflicts won the grant there. So I was studying conflicts at Harvard as a fellow, and then at Woodrow Wilson Center. Then I went to UC Berkeley to teach and research the South Caucasus there as a Ford Foundation scholar, Caucasus scholar. There was such a program. And then I returned to Rome as a NATO PFP research fellow also, as well as National Endowment for Democracy fellow.
It is particularly nice speaking to you as a friend and as a colleague. And I just want to start by asking a general question. How did you get involved in the work that you are doing now? Yeah, so I can start with that.
That's a good question, because I actually graduated from psychology department, and I studied cinema perception. I studied cross-cultural peculiarities of the old Soviet nations. But then when I came back home, because I studied in Moscow, when I came back home, I suddenly saw amazing things happening. The system was collapsing, crushing, something which you thought is stable and very strong, and it was happening literally with amazing speed. And when you see this global sort of changes developing before your eyes, you sort of think psychology is a bit too narrow to explain it. So that's how I switched to political science and international relations, because we were quickly becoming part of the wider world, and a lot of things were happening, conflict and dramas. So yes, and that's how I moved from psychology to international relations.
And then you worked in Russia, you worked in Baku, and then you founded a NGO, right?
I studied in Moscow and I lived for 10 years in Moscow. I left Baku quite early when I was 16. I went to school a bit earlier, and then we studied 10 years. And that's why I finished school when I was 16. And that's how I found myself in Moscow State University when I was 16. So I lived there for 10 years. And then when I came back to Baku, as I said, things were changing, old Soviet system collapsing. And we decided with my friends in the Academy of Sciences immediately, as soon as we got this chance, to create an independent think tank.
What was the name of the think tank when it was founded?
It had quite an ambitious name because probably took after American Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Basically,
Yeah.
it was, so that was the think tank. It was self-financing because we couldn't find any interested foundation in supporting us. I think most of the foundation would come to Georgia and Armenia, but less to Azerbaijan. So we had to be self-financing, and we would sell our weekly analysis to the international organizations, embassies, which were based in Azerbaijan. So that's how we survived. I was happy running my think tank because, in a sense, that was a state within a state. I created a small island of independent thinking, and I preserved it. My major motto was to preserve the quality and integrity of my expertise, regardless of the exceedingly worsening political conditions. And I did it until it was possible. In 2014, unfortunately, the government decided to prevent possible Euromaidans in Azerbaijan. In 2013, there was this famous protest in Ukraine. So that made the other authoritarian leaders concerned about their own situation. So they decided to make preventive measures and to open criminal cases against the leading public sort of opinion makers, and I was among them. So I had to leave the country. And since then, I've been residing in Oxford.
So I want to ask you more about your civil society work, but I also want to ask about your research and your focus on regional aspects of the regional aspects you study. So in your reflection, what are the dynamics for international cooperation and peace these days?
It's very interesting. On the one hand, the fact that Azerbaijan was important from the point of view of energy resources, it was the cause of a lot of positive dynamic in the region. There was a high attention from the side of the West, particularly the US, to our region. Turkey, Azerbaijan, Georgia, they united on the strategic basis and interests of the diversification of the energy supplies and energy transportation. It's very interesting in the context of the contemporary events in Ukraine. And you see how much the West is dependent on Russia's gas, Europe, first of all. In the 90s, the US was already working very hard together with its allies in the region to make the West independent from Russia oil. So Azerbaijan played a key role in that. And all of them, Shevardnadze, Aliyev, and Turkish government, they all understood importance of this bypassing Russia or creation of alternative supply by oil of the West by this oil. So in the 90s there was a big interest. So what was happening after, however, and I was quite involved in that because I was a consultant to many oil companies because I thought that was a positive thing. But then by 2003 we discovered that actually we are living in the petrol state, and petrol state has these inevitable negative consequences of the early commercial development of oil, because it affects, particularly in post-colonial situation, it affects the weak institutions, state institutions, and democratic institutions. It affects it in the negative way. So it basically blocks the development, the oil. So in 2003, when I observed the transfer of power, I became very disappointed and shocked in how the interests, energy interests of the West actually support their policies directed, unfortunately, against democratization in the country.
That's a really, I think, good point to make. And then building on and linking actually the two countries, Turkey as well, because in Turkey there has been a lot of scholars has underlined how the EU could actually promote a process that could enable a transition towards a more peaceful society in terms of recognizing Kurdish cultural rights, in terms of creating or facilitating the peace process. And why do you think the European Union and affiliated institutions, similar institutions, fail to promote kind of that? Because democracy and actually peace are quite connected together. So many say that without actually democracy, there can not be peace, and vice versa. So why, in your opinion, was the European Union unable to promote this agenda in the two countries?
Well, European Union was in general very weak as an actor in terms of conflict resolution. In Azerbaijan, it was a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So EU was just following or playing the role of supportive sort of actor to OSCE Minsk process. Minsk process has been a subject of criticism for a long time because it seems Minsk process only contributed to the frozenness of the conflict. So there was no significant progress there. First of all, because the composition was sort of quite bizarre. It's France, America, and co-chairman, France, America, and Russia. And the best thing they could do just not to fight each other. So they preserved the status quo. So it was not moving anywhere. And EU, because it declared that it is supportive of this process, means that EU also was not an influential actor in this regard. I don't know why EU was not taken more active role. Maybe because EU was represented there, was not officially represented, but France was in this process involved. It's hard to say. Then in Turkish case, again, it's hard to say because Turkish-Kurdish relations is more a domestic issue, while in Azerbaijan it's interstate conflict. So energy interests played a role in Azerbaijan conflict. In what sense? The fighting stopped in 94, but in order to attract energy companies, Aliyev had to establish peace. And that was the motivation. So it was a positive motivation to establish peace. So the peace was established for 25 years. And the interesting thing that it was supported without any peacekeeping forces, which is quite a unique situation, in spite of the very sort of intense confrontation and the war, which was taking place in the early 90s. So for a time being, it played a positive role, but unfortunately not it didn't create a motivation to move to the peace agreement. So it was only the energy interests were only contributing to the stabilization and status quo. And that's why we ended with the Second Karabakh War in 2020, because there was no progress in this peace process. It was frozen. Then Azerbaijan managed to spend its petrodollars on army and weapons supplies, so it became stronger than it used to be, and undertaken this counter sort of military operation, in order to restore its borders.
So I actually have a lot of questions that I can ask to you,
Yeah.
and but I just want to ask this maybe kind of the most important one. How do you think women are changing the field of both NGOs, research institutes, and academia in their work on conflict resolution? Do you think they're making a difference in this very male-dominated research atmosphere?
That's a good question. I think we had at this conference, which I mentioned in Georgia on the feminist foreign policy, I heard two opinions, one from Armenian representative, the other from Azerbaijani. The one was telling that she believes that women, purely by her participation, already bring some qualitative change in the field or whatever the subject she's doing. The other one would say that if she's part of the same structure or institution, then she can't really introduce something different. So I don't know the research which would support one or the other point of view. That's why I can just tell based on my experience. But it's more related to the fact that in Azerbaijan, for instance, there was enormous amount of women who took the leadership in the most critical situations in the during the transition, for instance. One of our activists, who was one of the founders of the Popular Front, he wrote the book where he said there were 3 women among 12 of the founders of the Popular Front, but these were the ones who were taking leadership and control during the most critical parts. You will see either the woman herself taking over and leadership and being quite successful in how they're dealing with that, or men may be less competitive and letting women do that because this is not where they see themselves successful or something like that. Yeah.
But as you study also ethnic conflicts as well as a part of your research, do you think that, again, women from civil society, different sectors, could actually provide different mechanisms to approach the resolution of the conflict in different ways than state officials and also like men in the public sphere as well?
I think in the early years of Karabakh conflict, these were women who were 2 outstanding women from both countries, from Armenia and Azerbaijan, who were leading the peace process. One of them, unfortunately, has died already on Armenian side. In Azerbaijan, that was Arzu Abdullayeva. In Armenia, that was Anaid Bayandur. And they were absolutely wonderful because they were supporting relations with each other regardless of and they were very consistent in their peace approach. There were different women. There were some women who were even more radical than men. But it's very interesting that the most consistent sort of connection was supported by these 2 women.
So these 2 women, they were policymakers, or were they just
They were NGOs.
NGOs?
Yeah,
Yes,
there were,
yes.
yeah, civil society. But one was Arzu Abdullayeva was Helsinki.
Helsinki Citizens Assembly.
Yes,
Yes,
exactly.
yes,
Yeah,
that's
yes. She
one.
was
Yes.
Helsinki Citizens Assembly. I suppose Alieva'nın might be the same, but she also was a writer, so they had a very broad sort of view on the issue.
So then, how do you think the conflict in Ukraine will shape the dynamics of the region today?
It's very interesting that in the 90s, there was this Guam organization. It's a security organization which was created, I think, by the initiative of Azerbaijan. It included Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. And Guam was united by its pro-Western position and the security concerns related to the secessionist conflicts, and not overtly said or declared, but Russia's role in this secessionist conflict. So there was quite a serious union between these four countries. And but gradually it weakened. It weakened due to the individual ways countries tried to balance this Russia's threat their own way, and also depending on what kind of institutions they were building inside the country. So more authoritarian states like Azerbaijan started to balance the relationship more with Russia, rather than taking very strictly pro-Western position, something like that. I mean, everyone more or less tried to balance. And then they witnessed how Russia was punishing those who were choosing the pro-Western way, like in case of Ukraine. That was a very clear demonstration what Russia can do to the country which decides just get rid fully of its influence, of Russia's influence. So in the beginning, the leaders of the South Caucasus, they became very cautious. So none of them openly was saying that, you know, they protect or they're for territorial integrity of Ukraine. So they were not taking sides. But I think gradually, when it was obvious that Russia is turning into the outcast and the West is uniting against, you know, Russia, and it's becoming really more and more a malignant force in the region, even Azerbaijani leader, who was very diplomatic, tried to be very diplomatic in this situation. I think by April already stated, foreign ministry stated that they are for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So I find that, first of all, our countries are put before the choice, of course, whether they can't really join the sanctions because they're dependent too much on Russia. There is a market for our agricultural producers next door, which is Russia. Also, there are gastarbeiters, enormous amount of gastarbeiters there. Still, our trade with Europe is 5 times bigger than with Russia. But because you're next door and you just saw what happens to the country, which is sort of really negative to Russia, um, you become a bit more diplomatic. However, as I said, Azerbaijan was giving a lot of support to Ukraine, humanitarian aid to Ukraine, in spite of not sort of joining the sanctions against Russia.
Unfortunately, militarism creates a culture of its own, and maybe we can see that with the current increasing militarist relationship between the states.
Yeah.
We've actually entered a negative spiral
Yes,
of, and which
Yeah.
kind of leads to a depressing state of affairs. And in that, maybe as a Azeri woman and a Turkish woman, what can we do together to increase the solidarity between the women who advocate a peaceful coexistence? Want to ask again on this slide, in these negative kind of context that we are in towards peace, how can Azeri and Turkish women meet each other and promote a language together?
Good question. First of all, you observed a very important thing, that military way of resolution of issues became dominant in our region. And it's not just the South Caucasus or Turkey. You see what's happening in Ukraine. So Ukraine and Russia also resolve the issue in a military way. And it's, in a sense, it's sort of strengthens this sort of the power of military way of resolution of conflicts. I trace it back to early 90s because I think even in our Karabakh conflict, the international community did not delegitimized the military way of resolution of our conflict, but actually agreeing to mediate in the Minsk group, because then the gains, military gains, become the bargaining chip. So when you turn the military gains into bargaining chip, the only conclusion the countries make is the more you manage to get militarily, the better deal you end up with. So that was, I think, a mistake, the whole mistake. There was not enough pressure, not enough normative sort of interference of European states, because now they're doing it with Russia. They're applying sanctions and things like that. But before, they were not sending the signals to the participants of the conflict, rather saying, you just agree with each other, it's okay, and things like that. UN adopted 4 resolutions about the immediate withdrawal of troops from the occupied territories, but there was no policy actions following it. So that was just, on the paper. Similar thing happened in Georgia in 2008. True, this didn't develop in the more large-scale war when Russia sort of intervened in Georgia. But I think Russia was making the conclusions that, military way is the only one which can sort of make myself, even if I'm a spoiler, but that's a branding which will attract their attention to me, and I can gain something out of it, and nobody's going to intervene. So this military domination of military way of resolution, because it's also a very good way of distracting the attention of the public, your constituency, from the problems you have. It's a very dramatic way of showing yourself a victor, right? You can do it, of course, via all sorts of IT methods, hacking or interfering in the elections, but it's less effective for your public, because when you come on the tanks and you show that these territories are sort of, gained by our army, that's more dramatic and more demonstrative, has a greater demonstrative effect. So what is important, that, of course, against the domination of this military way of resolving the issues, whether they're domestic or international, it's very challenging for whoever it is, women or men, to step in and to show the alternative culture. But there are things which are very powerful and which play on the side of those who move in, particularly women, is the dead bodies which are brought up from the fields, right? Battlefields. And this is about mothers, this is about wives and sisters and daughters. It's about people who have a direct sort of relations to what happens in the war. And that's why I think women can be the driving force in this bringing the alternative culture. I think it's happening now in Russia with this failed mobilization. And it just shows the mass outflow of young people from the country just shows that, this military way of resolution of conflicts and issues has its limits. So maybe we're now experiencing the period of decline or discreditation. We might enter that period of discrediting and decline of the military way.
Maybe we can also say that the role of media, social media, is quite important in that way. And then there you see a lot of kind of joint accounts like Ukrainian, Russian, when the war started in London as well, people were hugging each other, like saying, I'm Ukrainian, I'm Russian, and they were quite moving in a way. So then actually social media can actually amplify these messages.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that I was lucky to be at the same time at the Robert Bosch Academy with very prominent people who devote their lives to promotion of peace and defense of the minorities in their country, such as like Harsh Mander, who was an official in Gujarat, but who resigned as protest to the massacres of Muslims in India. He's extremely courageous person, but he also promotes the idea of radical love. And I think it's actually exactly at the time when you see that military force does not resolve the issue. That's where the ideas of radical love might come in and basically be taken to the level not only of the leaders, but also they brought by society, brought by women, because even in this crazy, absolutely crazy time, which is taking place now in the relationship between, for instance, Russia and Ukraine, or Armenia and Azerbaijan, you can see that love, positive messages, they disarm the person who is even very aggressively can. For instance, Emin Husseinov and Yuri Manvelan, two journalists from Azerbaijan and Armenia, almost immediately after the Karabakh War, the second in 2020, they started the dialogue, and it was amazing. It was attracting at least 200,000 people every time because they were demonstrating the alternative culture, the peace culture. At the moment when people just experienced a very fierce war. And it was immediately after that when people were attracted to this totally different culture of peace. And they were demonstrating that it's about, we have common problems and we can't solve them without cooperation. We have to cooperate, not fight. And the same thing is happening, I think eventually will happen to Russian and Ukrainians, and hopefully with Turkish and Kurdish populations. So hopefully, yeah.
Great. It's a great message to end with. Radical love. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you for listening to our podcast. Check our website, Eşitlik Adalet Kadın Platformu, the details of which can be found at the episode description section.